aggressive and forceful leadership to get it done, and it's going to have to come from mainly from the developed countries, although China and India will have an important role in it as well. I think this summer was an eye-opener. We had the UN IPCC report that basically told us two things. One, the window for preventing 1.5 Celsius climate temperature increases is closed. We're going to live with a new climate normal for the next little while and have to adapt to it. And the second one is there's still a big job to do. And I'll talk a bit about this at the end, the magnitude of this challenge, which is to prevent something worse from happening sometime in the second half of this century. But meanwhile, the climate headwinds are becoming stronger, and it's starting to show up in risks, in asset prices, in insurance costs, in food security, which was mentioned a minute ago. But the main thing I think that is slowing things right down is just a stunningly large amount of supply chain congestion in the global system. And this was unexpected. We have lived for a fairly long time in a world that, could be characterized as post-Great Financial Crisis, demand-constrained growth. And we've shifted very, very suddenly to supply constraints. And we have shortages of, labor in multiple categories. We have shortages of semiconductors, which runs across very large swaths of economies, shipping, containers, ports, etc. And I think these are now not only unexpected, but they're more severe than anybody expected. And the debate that's going on has to do with their duration, that whether this is transitional, and if it is, for how long? And lying in behind that is a discussion that the macroeconomists are conducting, having to do with whether or not we are kind of changing direction with respect to inflation. So we've lived with largely deflationary forces in the global economy for some considerable period of time. It obviously varies, depending on where you are and where you live. But beneath all of this, and the thing I really want to focus on is one way or another, and with maybe slowing growth, we're going to navigate through this. I really want to talk about these big transitions. There are a lot of them, but the four that get my attention are: one, the shift of the global economy, the center of gravity of the global economy to Asia, Central, East, and South. And this is a function of growth, which is a good thing. It's part of the convergence process. It's pretty much inevitable, and it means that we are going to live with a whole lot of challenges having to do with reconstructing the way the global economy is put together. And then you all know the one that's probably most visible, day to day, is the digital transformation of our economies and societies. That has so many dimensions, it's very difficult to kind of summarize them. But the pandemic has accelerated these transitions. So pick anything, remote working, hybrid activity of the type we're engaged in now, e-commerce, fintech, mobile payments, telehealth, meaning, delivery of healthcare from remote areas and so on. All of these things got accelerated, and the natural inertia that sits in any system was overcome by the kind of emergency characteristics associated with the pandemic. The second one is biomedical science and a healthcare revolution. These things obviously overlap, partly because the digital footprint, is pretty much everywhere. It's in science, it's in technology, it's in agriculture, it's in, in the way markets function. This is a brief aside, but when I was younger, I worked hard on the informational structure of markets. One of the things that fascinates me about the digital transformation is how big the effects of things like artificial intelligence, how big the effects are on the way the informational characteristics of our economies are put together. And the last one here is the energy transition. And that obviously refers to sort of dealing with the climate change problem. And in this era, and the speed of change is relatively quick. But the main thing I want to say, and what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time, are these big, powerful tools that have become available that are driving, they're kind of underpinnings of the change. I don't make any pretense that this kind of list is exhaustive at all. But these tools they've been around for a while, but what's distinctive now is that they're widely available. The costs keep coming down and down and down, so that the costs are no longer prohibitive. It means that talented people all over the world are able to access them and use them in pursuit of their objectives, whether they be commercial or scientific or whatever. And they are to me the driving force of this change. So I'm going to just review a few of them, if I may. So one is solar. When I was working with a number of developing countries 10 years ago on growth and development patterns, there was a real dilemma. I mean, these are economies that want to grow. Some of them had large supplies of coal. Coal is not a bad way to produce electricity, but it is by far the dirtiest version of electricity generation. It has the highest CO2 content, almost no matter what you do, unless you have a carbon and capture technology, which I think is a technology that's been discussed, but a bit too much ignored recently. At that time, solar wasn't within shooting distance. So, if you wanted to promote the growth of green energy, electricity generation, at that time, you were basically asking people to make a bad trade-off between sort of cost and therefore growth on the one hand and greenness on the other. That picture's changed. You can see here the costs of solar, more or less, however you calculate them, have come down by a factor of 5 or more in a decade. And this technology, along with wind and some others, are actually reasonably competitive with fossil fuels. And with the recent price hikes in fossil fuels, they're even more competitive. Now, you don't want to be too simple about this. I mean, there's a fair amount of investment required to get this done, not only in the generating capacity, but in grids. And at least in countries that have large installed bases of fossil fuel electricity generation, you have stranded assets. You're asking people to retire assets before their useful life is fully done. So there's a lot of work to do, but you've got a powerful tool whose costs have changed dramatically. Everybody knows what Moore's law is. This is a slightly different way of looking at it. So what this is the density of semiconductors on a chip, on a computer, on a semiconductor chip. And in my lifetime, these chips were not that dense, kind of slow. If you look at this graph, this is Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, which is certainly one of the leading in terms of technology semiconductor firms in the world. And we're right now, for those of you who have iPhones in your pocket, we're at 5 nanometers, which means roughly that you have 171 million transistors per square millimeter on the chip. So these things are supercomputers compared to the 1980s and 90s. And this process is going to continue. We're probably going to see in the next 3 to 5 years, 3 nanometer chips. The reason these are important is that it produces an enormous amount of computing power at relatively low cost. They're faster and they are much more efficient in terms of energy. They produce less heat. You don't need huge air conditioning systems to run them. Even, you still have to have air conditioning systems in big data centers, but it's an important part of the energy transition as well as an important part of powering the digital revolution. So you have artificial intelligence residing on your phone now. That wasn't even remotely close to possible, even 5 years ago. So these are really extraordinary. The whole artificial intelligence breakthrough of the last 10 years is powered by computing power, the digitalization of virtually all data, and very, very fast and increasingly fast networks. This is DNA sequencing. This is an important tool in biomedical and biological and agricultural research. And you can see from this graph, by the way, the scales on these things, this is logarithmic on the left-hand side of that graph, right? So logarithmic means if you're sort of going down in a straight line, you're going down at a constant geometric rate. So this thing sort of this comes from the National Institutes of Health in the United States, and you can see that it kind of followed a Moore's Law type pattern for a while. And that this is a cost of sequencing, a single strand of DNA. Back in the 2000, maybe it cost $100 million. And then we dropped off and, sort of outperformed Moore's Law by a lot, starting in the late 2000s. And we're down at, probably close to $1,000 per DNA sequence. As I say, this is an important tool. It means that, you don't have astronomical costs associated with using it. Universities, research institutions all over the world can do this as part of without breaking the budget. This one, gets my attention, and it is certainly relevant it's scary, but it's relevant to a wide range of research, including especially agricultural research and food security. This is a picture of the winners of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry last year. And the two women, Charpentier and Doudna. Charpentier's French and heads a major research institution in Germany, and Doudna is at the University of California, Berkeley. And they received the Nobel Prize for discovering how bacteria edit genes to protect themselves from viruses. And they found that what they learned about bacteria could be actually turned into a technology. So we can now edit gene sequences. Now this is a good example of the importance of raising the ethical issues early, because this can be used in ways that are either dangerous or worrying. And so the scientific community is focused on the ethical issues associated with when is what are the appropriate uses of technologies that are this powerful. But there's no question that this is a tool that has the potential to move things forward. I should say the ethical issues are now arising in artificial intelligence with respect to bias and a whole lot of other things, and they are starting also to get the attention that they deserve. And I love this one. This is also biology, I guess. So DeepMind, which is now owned by Alphabet in London, is an artificial intelligence research organization. They're probably best known for sort of, producing artificial intelligence systems that beat all human experts in games like Go. But their most recent, that I'm aware of, breakthrough was they are now apparently able to take the amino acid sequence of a protein and make a reasonably accurate forecast of its three-dimensional structure. The scientists in a variety of fields say this is just an enormous productivity breakthrough. Determining the three-dimensional structure of a protein in the lab is a very laborious and time-consuming process, and this is likely to make it go unbelievably more quickly. And the reason that's important is that the three-dimensional structure of proteins is what you need to know in order to know what they'll bind to, what molecules will bind to what others. So it's of first-order importance in drug discovery, in vaccines, including the ones that we are hoping we get spread around the world. It is, again, you can think of it as a productivity increasing tool where we're talking not about productivity in the economy, but productivity in a subset of the scientific community. Cloud computing, I think everybody knows what it is, but it's enormously powerful. It allows small and medium-sized businesses to access, kind of world-class, frontier type digital services, data, artificial intelligence algorithms, and so on, many of which are now open source, and scale it to the size of their business. So they don't need an IT department, I mean, it's not as big a one. They don't have to master a whole lot of things. Some of us have lived and worked in these highly productive entrepreneurial ecosystems. I used to live in California. There's one there in Silicon Valley. And one of the things you come to learn about those ecosystems is that they work at high intensity, in part because they're supporting stuff in the environment. So if you in that world, if you design a semiconductor, you don't have to know how to make it. If you start a business, you don't have to master accounting and financial reporting because somebody else will do it for you. And in the digital area, one way to think about cloud computing and platforms is that they basically they lower the barriers to entry, right? There's lots of entrepreneurial activity around the world. I'll show you that in a minute. And cloud computing is one of the ways that's enabled, and the digital platforms. I just put on the left here what these systems can do when, so in China, they have something called Singles Day in November. It's November 11th. It was invented by Alibaba as a marketing device. It's sort of like Black Friday in the United States, the day after Thanksgiving, only it's bigger because of the size of the Chinese economy. And I don't have the latest data, but at the peak of Singles Day, which is a 24-hour period, and that peak tends to occur around 1 a.m. in the morning. Everybody stays up and kind of uses it. Alibaba is processing on the order of 300,000 purchases per second. Right? And Alipay, the payment side of that process, is processing something similar in terms of payments per second. So these things scale and handle volumes at incredibly large quantities. This really intrigues me, and this comes from looking at the world through the eyes of investors, but there is something that's really quite striking, and it is, I think, associated with the increasing accessibility of the digital platforms and the increasing, coverage of digital connectedness via the mobile internet. By the way, the mobile internet, basically is 15 years old. I mean, it's stunning how fast it's grown. And so anyway, we have this, and what we're now seeing is a kind of explosion of entrepreneurial activity all around the world. So we used to think of this as kind of confined to a relatively small number of places. That's just no longer true. So the entrepreneurial activity and the supportive systems, including financing systems and so on, are becoming really, truly global. And it's a very exciting set of opportunities for economies, for young entrepreneurs, and so on. This is the way to, I mean, this is only one, maybe silly. These are unicorns. That is a company that relatively rapidly acquires a valuation of $1 billion or more. And that's unicorns updated. I won't spend any time on that. Let me close by talking about a little more soberly about challenges. But the message I wanted to leave you with was that incomplete list of tools, that growing but incomplete list of tools, is that we've got very powerful weapons that people are using to drive hopefully mostly productive and socially beneficial and inclusive change in these various areas. But let me close on the climate change thing. So this is a picture. It comes from Our World in Data. of CO2 emissions. Uh, these are gross emissions of CO2. They do not include methane, which is highly destructive with respect to warming. So they're not consumption based. They would look slightly different with consumption based, but not enough to change the kind of global picture. And you can see that, well, I guess the point of this graph is almost self-evident, which is CO2 emissions are going up pretty fast. We're at, I mean, people's measurements slightly differ from one from another, but this would be on the order of 36 billion tons a year. There's a lot of talk about net zero, but if we wanted to be, in the neighborhood of what would be consistent with trying to stick with 1.5 degrees of Celsius increase in temperature globally, you'd probably be down around, between 10 and 15 billion. Let's call it 13 or 14. So we're somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5 times that, and we're still rising. There was a hope that the pandemic, which saw a kind of leveling off, was a peak, and it may turn out to be a peak, but I kind of doubt it. If you look at, so we had a huge job to do. If you look at the top emitters and think about this terribly important meeting, COP26 coming up in Glasgow, these are the top emitters now. This picture changes as you move along because of growth in various economies. But these folks, China, the United States, EU, all in, everybody. Canada, Mexico, which is the rest of North America, India, Japan, and the world. And if you look at those, the top 6 that I listed here, that's 71% of global emissions of CO2. Again, if you did it in consumption-based terms, you'd shift stuff around a little bit in there. The United States would be higher and China would be lower because of the export patterns. But it wouldn't change the basic picture. So one of the challenges in Glasgow, I think, is to increase the aggressiveness of the commitments to reduce climate change, to reduce CO2 emissions, and the major players have to be on board, or we can't get the job done. If you ask yourself, well, what is the magnitude of this challenge? I'm not particularly pessimistic, although I think it's going to be tough to kind of get on the right path in the short run. But if the global economy grows in the post-pandemic period at 3%, which I think is a reasonable number given the amount of growth potential in a wide variety of middle-income countries, it's, something catastrophic would have to happen if it dropped way below that. Now, developed economies aren't going to grow at that rate, but surely Central Asian economies can, China can, India certainly can. You can probably has potential growth rate of 8% or something like that. And if the goal is to get to somewhere around 14 billion tons, that is, of carbon dioxide emissions globally by 2040, then if you do a little calculation, you realize that the carbon intensity of the global economy, that is the amount of carbon you put out per whatever, dollar, euro, right, yuan of global GDP has to decline at the rate of 7% a year. And that is a big, big number, right? And that has to happen on average every year for 20 years, right? So I think, we need, in my view, to get on with it, but to be really honest about the magnitude of the challenge. The other thing I think it's worth noting is that most, serious people who estimate the kinds of investments globally that are needed in order to accomplish this put the number somewhere between $3 and $3 trillion a year. And that's probably split something like 50-50 between government or public sector and the private sector. So that's just a very big challenge. And the last slide I have, I go back to this summer. when the UN IPCC panel issued this report and said basically what I said before. You know, we're going to have the new climate normal is what we got and what we saw this summer. And so what struck me was the frequencies and severity and global coverage of extreme climate events. So this is floods. There's a website that keeps track of major floods globally, and you can see the coverage is global, and there's a lot of them. So I guess that is kind of the new normal we're going to live with. It's probably, this is a little speculative, but I think it's probably at the level where it will start to have noticeable effects on growth and macroeconomic outcomes, but we'll see. So let me stop there, and hopefully I've left enough time for some questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Spence, for such a wonderful and insightful presentation on what's going on. I think we all now understand much better the new normal, because it is not only about knowing things, it is about understanding things. And I particularly liked also your comments and insights that were not only about the macro headwinds that we're experiencing with the pandemic, with the disruptions in trade and supply chains, with climate change, but also the tailwinds or macro tailwinds, if I may call them that way, that would, as you said, hopefully drive rapid change and hopefully bring progress much, much faster. So thank you very much. I cannot say how pleased we all are to have you here with us today and to hear from you, your world-class expertise. So now, ladies and gentlemen, we're moving to our questions and answers session. We have about 500 participants on Zoom and on YouTube, 550 to be exact. And we have our dear students that have joined offline at the CASA ATU. So we have actually a number of questions from Zoom and on YouTube as well. But I would like to give the priority to our dear students so that they will have the opportunity to address their questions to our honorable speaker. And then if we will have time, we will also give the floor for some questions that we received from Zoom and YouTube. So dear ladies and gentlemen, and dear students, please let me open the floor to the questions and answers session.
Hello, hello, Professor Spence. My name is Ima. I'm a student of the economy faculty here in Agritechnical University. And my question is, first of all, thank you for your presentation. My question. You said that, world is recovering from enormous damage that caused by the pandemic situation. And so what global economic risks do you see at this stage, and especially for developing countries? Thank you.
Well, that's a very good question. At the risk of sort of overgeneralizing, from my point of view, the vaccine rollout has gone pretty well in the developed countries, and the recoveries are reasonably impressive as we open up sectors. I think while things vary from one part of the world to another, so generalizations usually are things you can find a counterexample to. I think on balance, the middle income countries are in reasonably good shape. That is, they have fiscal space to buffer the shock and have used it to some extent. Excuse me, I was muted. All right, I'll start again. sort of briefly, I think that developed countries are in reasonably good shape in the vaccine rollout. You know, although there's some hiccups at the start. I'm in Italy right now. We fell behind Israel, the UK, and the United States, but we've sort of caught up. I think we've more than caught up. Moving to, you know, countries that have a very large fraction of the world's population, my sense is that most of the middle income countries are in reasonably good shape. That is, they have fiscal resources that they've been able to use to buffer the shock of the pandemic and to redistribute the damage so that the lower income folks in their economies don't bear the entire burden. This has involved moving balance sheet damage to the public sector in most countries, and that's probably the right thing to do. I mean, nobody wants to see, you know, sovereign debt to GDP ratios rising over 100%, but if the alternative is to leave the damage with people who are least able to withstand the shock, it's probably the right thing to do. So I think the vaccine rollout will go reasonably well in a wide range of middle income countries. Now, is it perfect? No. Is COVAX working well, meaning properly financed and able to buy vaccines? No. But my main worry right now is the lower income countries, because they do not have the fiscal space. Their public finances have deteriorated badly. There will probably be debt restructurings that I hope the IMF and other international institutions, you know, are able to help with and do it right. But the thing I said before, the one that's most worrying, is the vaccine rollout is just way too slow. And so, I mean, at the risk of over dramatizing, you know, if you leave, I don't know, somewhere between 1 and 2 billion people unvaccinated, you could reasonably expect to have Delta 2 and then Delta 3 and then Delta 4 feeding back into the global system. The thing that's a bit frustrating about this is that it's not an impossible problem to solve. I mean, we can produce the vaccines so that we can get the job done in a relatively short period of time. And it's not that expensive, right? Maybe $200-300 billion. You might say, well, that's a lot of money. But then if you ask yourself the question, well, what's the cost of not doing it? It comes up in the trillions of dollars. So it looks like a pretty good investment, kind of for everybody, right? Not just, so this isn't charity. I mean, I think getting the global economy back on its feet is really, it's a kind of high priority. And the proposition that nobody's really safe and free and clear of this until almost everybody is true. So that's kind of my tour of the horizon. I think, you know, it's the more vulnerable economically and financially that we need to worry most about.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Camilla, for your question. Thank you very much, Professor Spence. Absolutely agreed. No one is safe until all are safe. Dear students, please, small comment, when you address your question, please don't speak too fast. I know you all are super excited to have such a high-profile speaker and guest with us here today, but please don't speak too fast. Breathe normally, state your name and your question. Thank you.
Me too.
Hello, Dr. Spence. My name is Anna. I have one more question. My question is, many central banks declare the possibility of introducing their own digital currencies.
Yep.
So how will this affect the financial market? What do you think about it?
That's a very good question. You know, there's a lot of talk about this, and I think we're kind of in mid-journey, so I'm not sure we know where we're going to end up. But let me try. I think, first of all, digital currencies in general, right, are extremely efficient. I mean, if you look at payment systems, you know, the well-developed ones, they're, you know, they have costs that are way below, you know, even things like credit cards and whatnot. I mean, by a factor of 2 or 3 or 4, right? So I think we're going digital. So that's point one. Point two is I think the central banks have to maintain control of the currency. So that's going to put them in the digital currency world. But I think the confusion out there is the difference between a central bank controlled digital currency, which is where I think we're going to go, and cryptocurrencies, which are an attempt by people essentially to produce an alternative currency that doesn't have a central, manager. And there, I think the central banks are going to view that as dangerous because then they lose control of things like the money supply. And so I don't think those things are going to take root. Some of the times they're going to ban them. I mean, China has banned crypto, currencies pretty much across the board. This is, by the way, this is different from blockchain, right? Blockchain is a broader technology, and blockchain has important uses in sort of keeping track of what's going on in supply chains and whatnot. So I think blockchain is not being ruled out. I guess the last thing I would say, if you look at the kind of, if you view a bunch of available cryptocurrencies as assets, they're very volatile. And they're volatile enough that I don't think of them as, much of a currency. They're more like a kind of risky asset class. And finally, cryptocurrencies are going to develop in the world of, illegality, right? In the dark web, they're going to be used to kind of hide payments. And that's going to be, central banks are going to ask themselves, financial regulators generally, who have all kinds of systems for detecting money laundering and illegal activity and terrorist activity and so on, are going to sort of ask themselves the question, do we really want another currency for those folks to use that we can't track? And I think once you get to that point, you're going to have pressure to try to suppress these things. Essentially, is where I think we're going. So digital currencies, yes. Ones that are separated from the normal kind of regulatory, banking, monetary mechanisms, probably no.
I see. Thank you very much, Professor Spence, for your answer. I think the people from our government and the business circles, not only students, were listening very careful to your insights on that one, because I believe we as our country were standing in front of the dilemma on which way to go, whether to embrace and foster or whether to ban those new kind of subsectors that are developing, especially given that we have natural competitive advantages with a very low cost of energy and of course, a relatively cold climate. So thank you very much for your answers and insights and your thoughts on this. Please, let us give the floor to our next student with his question, please.
My name is Arnur. Dear Professor Spence, can you share, please, your view on how food genome editing will affect on global food security?
I'm not an expert in this area, but I would imagine that if it's done carefully, that, gene editing is an important tool for producing crops that are more productive, that is, the yields are higher, that are more resistant to disease or attack or so on. So, but that's kind of secondhand. That's what I hear from people who are engaged in doing research in those fields or in the business side of that as well. So that's my best guess. The reason for being careful, of course, is that, here in Europe, there's a considerable amount of resistance to genetically modified foods, right? And gene editing is certainly a pretty powerful way of genetically modifying plants, among other things. So I think that. So if you ask yourself, where does that resistance come from, or reluctance to let that kind of run? I think it's partly, uncertainty about what the consequences are. Will you produce something that you really didn't expect? I mean, we all have experiences with with the transmission of plants from one environment to another across the globe, producing a fair amount of damage, right? And, so if you just take a kind of foreign, strange, new plant or animal into a different ecosystem, natural ecosystem, you can have pretty unpredictable effects. I think there's some concern that we got to have mechanisms to be pretty sure. Now, if genetically modified, plants, sources of food can't reproduce themselves, then that's a different question, right? Then you have a kind of natural safety mechanism. But anyway, this belongs to the agricultural and biological scientists. But I do. These are very powerful technologies. I mean, we had this thing in China, where the one Chinese scientist used this technique to produce, I think it was HIV resistant young babies through genetic modification. That produced an outburst of reaction from scientists within China and outside. So that crossed a line that I think a very wide range of not just scientists, but ordinary people think is a line we shouldn't cross, at least not right now.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, colleagues. Our next question, please. Do we have any more questions from our dear audience, please?
Yes, please. Good day. Good day, Professor Spence.
Good day. Yes, I can't see you, but good day.
Please, Arman. Yep. You're on mute.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, a bit technical. Good day, Professor Spence. My name is Arman Rustembayev. I'm a doctor, PhD, technical faculty, and my questions. The world is under the new technological revolutions, and what do you recommend to students to focus now to prepare ourselves for these challenges and the changes? And the second question, what are the US students learning right now to cope with in the future? And last questions, please. What are new technologies US university can share with us today?
In the universities, that last question, so yeah, right? Okay. I think on this first question, what should people prepare for? I think I've always thought, that the thing to do is to kind of study a broad range of things until you stumble on something that really just, gets your attention, right? Makes you excited, makes you want to get up in the morning, and then just dig in and kind of focus on that. And sometimes that produces entrepreneurs, and sometimes it produces, social entrepreneurs, people who want to make society better, and that's great. Or sometimes it produces academics, researchers, and something like that. That's also terrific. But I think the kind of unifying theme is there's a lot of opportunity out there. There's so many areas where one can, just find things that are fascinating, and at the same time make a big contribution to your fellow human beings. That is just a kind of, I think higher education is best when it's when it asks people to get on the learning curve and then go find that thing that they just really want to try to do. And it'll be different for different people. I don't think I guess I would say, if I had to be substantive about it, I'd try to be at some level in the courses that one selects reasonably knowledgeable about a wide range of things that are are changing quickly and producing big opportunities, the kinds of things I talked about. But but that is kind of in passing while you're looking for the thing you really want to do. And some of your students will end up in artificial intelligence research. You can make a pretty good living there now. Some of you might even be economists, much and all, as we sometimes disliked. In the USA, I think that's going on. We're producing fewer engineers than we should, and people interested in science and whatnot. We have a lot of them, but many of them come from other parts of the world. So that's a good thing. I mean, it's good for the country. But I think, we could do a better job of making these things accessible and interesting to a wider range of young people in our country. On education itself, I think, my best prediction is we're going to go back as fast as we can, as fast as the pandemic will let us largely in most of the institutions, elite ones like this one, to in-person, interaction, because I think it's so important. And I think the same thing is true for, below higher education. It's just the social development associated with remote activity just isn't adequate. It's also, problematic from a distributional point of view, since the access to, quiet space, the right equipment, and so on is correlated with income and levels and wealth. But having said that, I think we've discovered a whole bunch of possibilities for augmenting the educational process, either by bringing people from outside, or augmenting the educational process with, things that are technical, that are well done on the internet. So I think that's the direction we're going. It's going to be a little experimental as time goes on. And some of this is not new. I mean, we've had big online courses before, but now I think the receptivity is different, and we can take advantage of that. By the way, I think the same thing's going to happen in healthcare, Armand. We could have done telehealth, at least in much of the world. We got the connectivity, before we had the pandemic. We just didn't get around to it. And that was demand and supply, right? The receivers of healthcare services didn't really think that was a very good option. And the doctors didn't want to do it either. And then when we had no choice, we discovered it was a lot better than we thought. So I think things like that will happen in education. Now, for the skills transitions associated with the digital revolution, I think that the learning from the pandemic experience will be extremely helpful. I think we can leverage technology to help people in a major way, make the skills transitions as the digital, transition changes job and work on the way through.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Professor Spence. As people say, it's not that I work hard under pressure, it's just that I only work under pressure. So hopefully this pressure that we're living under today, with all this macro situation, will help us, all humanity, boost productivity and boost global economy. Dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for such a wonderful event. I think, we have time for just one final question, and then we'll have to call it a day. Please.
Okay.
Thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. Hello, Dr. Spence. I have actually two questions, because I have listened to your lecture and I have brooded over it. Now, the first question I had was, because of the supply chains have been disrupted, the food security of the world has become somewhat of a crisis. And what do you think, who will suffer the most from the food security being so brittle after the supply chains have shattered? And the other question was, after you have just mentioned that the central banks should go to the cryptocurrency, how do you think they will retain control over the fiscal policy if they will be effectively removed from the control of the printing press?
Okay, but they're both good questions. So I was probably unclear on the second question. So let me go there first. I think they will. The central banks will essentially produce and take control of the digital currencies, and they will not call them cryptocurrencies, and they will essentially, you can think of that as the monetary system adapting to a digital world, right? So it won't feel wildly different from what we have, and I think they will not. They will take steps to limit the extent to which what are now called cryptocurrencies are actually used as currencies. Now, I realize they're spreading to some extent, but I don't think the financial regulators and the central banks are going to allow that to replace, the fiat money transformed to a digital form, which they control. They won't allow it
So you think it will be a hybrid system?
Yeah, so people tend to use the word digital currency and cryptocurrency interchangeably, and I'm saying no, that digital currencies, controlled by the central bank, are different from cryptocurrencies based on blockchain, where there's no centrally organizing, entity. Does that make sense?
That does make sense if it is a hybrid system. But for the first question,
yeah,
have been disrupted, and who suffered the most from it?
Well, it's hard to say at this point. I mean, it depends on how severe it gets and how long it lasts. So if you look at the developed world, it looks like the problem's worst in the UK. And the problem with figuring that out is we can't, we have it's called collinearity in statistics. So we have Brexit and we have the sort of supply chain congestion, and they're both sort of operating. So there are empty shelves in Britain now, and they have a huge problem with trucking and whatnot. But part of that problem is the spillover effect of Brexit, because a huge number of people, like well over 1 million people who came from other parts of Europe and worked in the UK, including in the transportation sector, just went home, right, after Brexit and in the pandemic. And so to be honest with you, I think the food security issues for a wide range of people, especially in lower income countries, are more closely connected with climate change. There's a lot of these places when you don't have sort of significant environmental damage are relatively self-sufficient in food, not at a high level, but relatively self-sufficient. But climate change can kind of produce droughts, famines, and whatnot, and eventually mass migration. And so I guess my concern about a large swath of humanity in terms of food security is as our first speaker said, is associated with the adverse impact of climate change mainly. Now, I may be wrong. There may be, pockets of congestion in the supply chains that, are particularly damaging in very specific places. There's no question there's delays. So if there's some essential ingredient that you need, whether it's in food, it wouldn't be a semiconductor probably, but it could be tractors, But the automobile industry has been experiencing a major setback, largely because of the semiconductor thing. Cars used to be pretty simple little things, and now they're computers, in part, right? Anyway,
Thank you.
That's my best guess.
Thank you, Professor Spence. I know we're slightly over time, but Professor Spence, if you allow, please, 2 more questions from the audience.
Perfect.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Hello, my name is Arman.
Another Arman. Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Spence, I would like to ask you quite a personal question, if you allow.
Sure.
As I know, in your childhood and in your school years, students students here, you were interested in hockey. Yes. This sport is quite popular in the north part of Kazakhstan. And so could you tell us how hockey has changed your life and personality?
That's a good question. Well, I should say it's ice hockey. That won't be, yeah, but that's not relevant, because it's pretty cold over where you live, especially in the north. But in a fairly large part of the world, when you say hockey, they mean field hockey, right? But I grew up in Canada, so for me, it was ice hockey. I mean, pretty much everybody either skated or played ice hockey. So it didn't seem like, particularly abnormal to be on skates at age 2 or 3. And no, I loved it. I would say, in general terms, competitive sports is a useful part of kind of getting ready for the world, right? Because you learn that you can compete and still be friends. You learn what the boundaries are, right? You learn you have a sense of the competition is neither cutthroat, nor a bad thing. It's just fun, but you get the framework in your head. I'll tell you a story. When I was 11 years old, I played for a team that was not part of the school system. And that was true of hockey in Canada and baseball in the United States, the kind of, anyway, so when we were 11, we played 75 games and practiced another 40. My parents went nuts because they had to drive me to the rink every time we played or practiced. It was practically half the year. And so we were pretty good. And we were in the farm system. We were sponsored by the Chicago Blackhawks, which is one of the teams, it still is, in the NHL, National Hockey League. But the athletic director of the school I was in, which is a good school, it was part of the University of Toronto, called me in one day, and he said, basically, if you do that again, I'll have you kicked out of the school. And I said, really? I said, why? And he said, because it'll ruin your academic life, and eventually you'll end up in a world where there's no option. So I quit. And after that, I played school hockey, which was fine. But I got out of the system. That was the only way in those days. Not anymore, but in those days, it was the only way to get to the professional hockey leagues. So I probably wouldn't have made it anyway. So the opportunity cost was probably zero. But I love
Thank
talking.
you. Thank you so much for sharing your personal life stories and experiences. Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Spence. My name is Sultanat. So, Dr. Spence, have you aspired to receive the Nobel Prize in economics? And how has your life changed? How has your life changed after this award? And what advice would you give to the two students to become a successful scientist?
Right. These are great questions. First of all, I don't think most people, most people, as far as I can tell, who receive the Nobel Prize in either sciences or economics or literature, I don't think, or peace for that matter, they don't aspire to it. They're just doing what they like to do. And I think there's an element, so who ends up there? I think it's an element of, there's lots of really talented people in every field doing things. So there's a certain element of luck in it. You stumble on something that turns out, with the benefit of hindsight, to be of some significance in whatever field you're in. But we can probably find exceptions. But I haven't run into many people who said, gee, I decided when I was 17 that I really wanted to receive a Nobel Prize. Because it doesn't make any sense. The odds are so low, right, of having that last little bit of luck that gets you there. I don't think that's what I mean. It does change your life. You got to be a little careful. People listen to you when they didn't even know who you were and when they couldn't care less what you said. And Myron Scholes told me an interesting thing that I'll repeat to you. shortly after, I and Joe Stiglitz and George Akerlof received, because Myron received the Nobel Prize, I think it was 97 or 98. And we were colleagues at Stanford. He took me aside and said, there's two things you need to know. One, you probably think that sort of lecture you have to give is a joke, but it's not. They're serious. They want you to actually give a lecture. And I said, okay, I'll take that seriously. And he said, the other thing is people are going to come up to you, journalists, everybody, and they're going to ask you questions thinking you know everything about everything, and you don't. And you have to learn to say, I don't know. And I thought that was, really excellent advice. So yeah, people ask you a lot of things and you do get more attention than you would have otherwise. But you got to be a little careful, not to pretend to be an expert, or have insight that is indistinguishable from almost everybody else on the planet. But I think I answered the question about, what do you do if you want to become a scientist? I think the only thing I would add to that, other than scanning until you find something that just intrigues you so much you don't really want to do anything else, is it's important to be with mentors and colleagues that are A, really good, but B, also really supportive. And I think that's true of most great scientists, regardless of where you are in the world. They have labs, they bring, they develop people. They think a fair amount of what they're doing in the world is developing people and not just narrowly doing their own thing. But you need to find that kind of environment, I think, is where the great ideas and breakthroughs come from.
I see. Thank you so much, Professor Spence. We have some questions from Zoom audience. I'm afraid I will have to give only one opportunity. There are questions on cryptocurrencies, but you've already shared us your perspectives on that, and answering the potential regulator of cryptocurrencies. I think this discussion might be a lengthy one, so we would have to skip that. But I would like to give the floor to an interesting question, even so it's in a bit of in a category of we believe you know everything. So therefore, we want to ask you everything. And so there is an interesting question from Mr. Rahimjan Orashan. I believe we are able to give him the opportunity to ask the question himself. But if not, if he's on mute, then I would read it loud.
There he is.
Yeah, please, please, Rahimjan. Yeah.
Hello, Professor Michael. Thank you for
you?
your time. Thank you for this conference, first of all. And then there is my question about the Elon Musk's idea of moving to Mars. As our planet has limited resources, and we might have some global natural disasters in future, maybe some pandemic that will, I hope, not kill our humanity. But what do you think about this idea of moving to Mars?
Well, I mean, it's easy to laugh at it because it may happen. And if we do it right, we won't be just exploiting a larger and larger collection of things. I mean, I guess the one reason to move to Mars is to go mining or something like that. But that's not what Elon Musk has in mind. So, I admire Elon Musk because he doesn't take conventional wisdom and allow it to be a constraint. And he's done it over and over again. And so, I don't know how he does it. Maybe it's just put together that way. But I think, so my real reaction to that suggestion is that's classic Elon Musk, right? Let's just think about something that most people would dismiss or stick in the category of science fiction. And, and maybe something interesting will happen and maybe it won't. But he's produced quite a lot of change in the world. I mean, I think he has accelerated, or the shifting to electronic mobility pretty significantly. Because everybody else is on board now. Not everybody, but I mean, it's a tsunami coming, and that's good. But but he seems to sort of overcome inertial forces, more successfully than most people. I mean, I always listen to him. You know, when he's talking about, I don't always agree. You know, he stands up and says artificial intelligence is truly dangerous or something like that, and then starts talking about that. I don't always agree with that, but you know, he does new things and makes people think in a way that relatively a few other people really do.
Thank you, Professor Spence. So I think let me close by summarizing the few points of discussions that we had. Thank you very much again for your insights on all the valuable topics, ranging from digital transformations to pandemic impact to the new macro tailwinds. But I also want to personally thank you. And I would like, for the benefit of our dear students, actually, I would like to close our today's event with a quote from a very wise man, uncle of Spider-Man, who once said, with great powers comes great responsibility. Чем больше сила, тем больше ответственность. So what I mean is that you are a superhero to all of us, especially to the economic science students, but also to the business world and professional world and academia. Thank you very much for sharing your intellectual capacity, your superhuman brain power, to share with us your insights so that we can learn from you, so that we can get the global perspectives firsthand. And thank you for motivating our students with today's lecture so that they aspire to learn more, be more, and try to become more. Thank you very much again from all of us. Great thanks to organizers of this event, and thank you to the participants and to our dear students for joining and not missing this wonderful opportunity. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Best
Thank you,
of luck
Professor
to all of
Spence.
you, eh? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Max Hutt.
We
It's good to
believe
see you.
more than 1,000 people became your new students.
That would be great.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So you
That
have
would be great.
1,000 credits to your karma.
That's terrific. Well, we'll see you all soon, I hope, in person.
Thank you.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank